Listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to the webcast. My name's Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Chapter of APA and Vice Chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I will be the moderator for today's webcast. Today, Friday, February 27th, we will hear the presentation, Millennials and Mobility in the Modern West. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or call the 1-800 number shown. For content questions related to the presentation, type those in the questions box also located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. And if your question is for a particular panelist, please state who the question is for. And we will answer questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions. Thank you to all of the participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today's webcast in particular is sponsored by the Utah chapter. To learn more about APA chapters, visit planning.org/chapters. And to learn about divisions, visit planning.org/divisions. On your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts for March. To register for these webcasts, visit utah-apa.org/webcasts. Coming from the Midwest, it feels so good to say that we're almost to March. Although I don't know if that will change the weather too much, but at least it feels good to say we're entering March. Okay, to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, visit planning.org/CM, go to your dashboard, select activities by provider. Again, today's provider is the Utah chapter, and then select today's title. This webcast will be approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. Some recorded webcasts are available for distance education. For availability of our distance education credits, check our webcast webpage again at utah-apa.org/webcasts. And like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our upcoming sessions. And we are recording today's webcast. It will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. And a PDF of the presentation will be available at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. I'd now like to introduce today's speakers so we can get started. Julia Collins is a transportation planner at Wasatch Front Regional Council, which is the metropolitan planning organization for 2 urbanized areas in the Salt Lake City region. And she specializes in the relationships between land use and transportation. At Wasatch Front Regional Council, Julia manages one of the organization's grant programs called the Local Planning Resource Program, which provides support and technical expertise to local governments on planning and transportation-related projects. Her work includes managing and participating in community projects by providing technical assistance to local planning projects and studies. She also provides support on numerous active transportation projects throughout the Salt Lake City metropolitan area and manages the regional transportation bicycle plans for Wasatch Front Regional Council. Previously, Julia committed much of her time through a critical role in the project management for the Sustainable Communities Grant awarded to Utah by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in 2011. Prior to joining Wasatch Front Regional Council, Julia worked in economic development and True Partners Consulting in Chicago, where she negotiated both state and local tax credits paired with economic development incentives. Julia holds a master's in city and metropolitan planning from the University of Utah and a bachelor's degree from Hobart and William Smith colleges. And in true millennial form, Julia prefers to be on her bicycle. Richard Brockmeyer is a strategic planner with the Utah Transit Authority. Much of his work focuses on implementing transit-oriented development across the UTA service area. This includes evaluating land use policies for municipalities and counties, building partnerships with communities interested in developing around current and future rail and bus stations, as well as working with UTA TOD department to achieve joint development projects. Richard has managed several station area land use planning activities and is responsible for GIS application development and transportation modeling for the UTA planning department. He also assists with managing the transit component of the regional transportation plans with Wasatch Front Regional Council and Mountain Land Association of Governments. Richard recently received his AICP certification and is a graduate of Arizona State University's Master of Urban and Environmental Planning program, where he also received a certificate in transportation systems. He received his bachelor's degree in history from Westminster College. Like many millennials, Richard enjoys playing video games and surfing the internet, but also enjoys biking, running, and playing with his 2-year-old son. With that, I am going to turn it over to Julia and Richard.
Hi, thanks. I believe everybody can see the presentation now. Thanks for the opportunity. We're really excited to talk today about the millennial generation and the impacts that generation is having and it will continue to have on mobility and land use and the planning profession in general. I'll provide sort of an overview of millennials and some of the key trends of this generation. I'll then turn the time over to Julia, who's going to describe how those trends are impacting the planning profession and what's changing and why we should pay attention. So, there we go. First, who are they? There's not a definitive definition of when millennials are born, but typically it's anywhere from 1980 to 2003. An APTA, American Public Transit Association, study that came out recently described as 1982 to 2003. It's the largest, most diverse, and most multimodal generation in history. They're known for connecting through technology. And they're also known by a number of different names. So maybe if you're not aware of millennials, you've probably heard Generation Y, Echo Boomers, Generation Next, Generation We, Generation Me, Generation Net, or the global generation. Don't ask me how we were known as Generation We and Generation Me at the same time. Sort of an interesting relationship there. How big is the population and why we care so much about this population? Again, it's the largest in the nation right now. It's on par with the baby boomers. And this generation is now moving into a life cycle that drives the economy, housing, and development. In terms of where they're located, they're going to be very pronounced everywhere, but especially in the West. And this map sort of just shows the density by state. And as you can see, Utah as a state actually has the highest millennial population in the nation. So the trends we're going to discuss here are going to be very pronounced in our region, and that's why our organizations are so interested in understanding millennials and their impacts. This graphic is from a Nielsen publication which further breaks down concentrations of millennial populations. Simply put, millennials are more highly concentrated in the western United States. So now diving into some of the key trends. Again, as I mentioned before, they're the most racially diverse generation in American history. And 43% of millennial adults are actually non-white, the highest share of any generation. The foreign-born population continues to grow. In 2010, it was 12.9% of the total population, and much of this growth is in the millennial or younger generation, as you can see from the graph here. This graphic is courtesy of Pam Perlich, a senior research economist at University of Utah, and it shows the share of 5 to 17-year-olds with immigrant parents in 2007 to 2008. So these are millennials. And you can see just how pronounced that is in the Southwest and the impact that it's going to have in this area. Clearly, racial diversity and exposure to different cultural backgrounds is going to be shaping this generation a lot. In terms of lifestyle trends, millennials are making different choices than previous generations. They're waiting longer to get married, or in some cases not marrying at all. And this graph shows the stark difference between generations. Over half the population of 18 to 32-year-olds were married in the silent generation, and nearly half in the boomer generation. Now only about a quarter of millennials are married at the same time. So there are a number of reasons for this, and actually some of the other trends that I go over will explain part of this trend. But certainly there's an element of choice to this figure as well. Birth rates have also declined considerably since the 60s and 70s and remain low. Millennials are waiting longer to get married and opting out of marriage, so obviously they're having less children. So this will likely continue, this birth rate number. And just as sort of an example, of my high school and college friends, all millennials, I'm the only one who currently has a child, and probably one of two that even plans to have children. So very different way of looking at their life and what they want to do with their life. So again, this is impacting family size. There's been a gradual decline in larger family households, especially 5 people or more. And there's more and more one-person and two-person households. So what does this mean for the future of development, the size of housing that we're building, the type of housing that we're building? It's important to note that in Utah, at least, while average household size is likely going to decline as well, actually the average household size here is quite a bit higher than the national average. And that's due primarily to local culture. I added this slide because I think it's worth noting that not all national trends fit a specific place. But even in Utah, we can probably expect household sizes to decline, but maybe not at a similar rate, but definitely starting at a much higher base. Multi-generational households have also risen, doubling since the 1980s. Now, of course, a lot of this has to do with the recession and the financial burden that the millennial generation has been saddled with, that I'll describe in a few minutes. But think just how might this change millennial attitudes to things like accessory dwelling units? You can see here on this graph the different living arrangements of young adults, 1968 compared to 2012. And there's a lot of living at home with parents and a big growth in other independent living arrangements too. Part of this generational shift has to do with attitudes for a whole host of reasons on when adulthood begins. So this is a survey of millennial parents on when they expect their children to be financially independent. And you can see there's a big shift. The same question was asked in 1993. 22 is sort of expected. You're out in the world and you're supposed to fend for yourself. That's changed quite a bit. This 2011 number shows that really people are expecting their children to be sort of financially dependent to 25 or older. This is a great graph that I think will underscore just how pronounced this shift in multi-generational households has been. Young adults are now more likely than adults 85 and older to live in a multi-generational household. So just think about that for a second. you think about mother-in-law apartments or units, accessory dwelling units, serving an elderly generation, but what about serving a younger generation and the importance of that? And we can see that trend occurring right now. Again, a lot of this is due to economic conditions, but those don't change overnight. And racial diversity, waiting to marry, seeking higher educational opportunities will probably keep this trend up higher than it has historically been, or at least somewhat steady. So shifting gears a bit more to what millennials are probably most well known for, and that's being connected through technology. I had a lot of fun making this little timeline, made me pretty nostalgic of my own time growing up. But just take a look at this. Millennials were raised with technology in a way that few other generations have been impacted. The blue line at the bottom sort of indicates the time where millennials were born. So, for example, someone born in the mid 80s, I've always known a world with personal computers, cell phones, and video games. By the time I was in junior high, I was talking to my friends on AOL Instant Messenger and communicating instantaneously with people across the globe. By the time I graduated my undergrad program, the primary communication tool was Facebook and text messaging using a smartphone. Someone born just a few years after me never knew a world without the internet. Someone born at the tail end of the millennial generation never experienced a world without Wi-Fi or camera phones. Technology, like it has with other generations, has shaped the millennial generation, but in a very personal way. It connected the generation together digitally. So just a few graphics poking a little fun at ourselves on how connected we are to our devices. And so this one shows where it's acceptable to use social media or where it's not acceptable to use social media. And you can see young adults 18 to 24 are twice as likely to use social media in the bathroom compared to an average of 21% of the entire population. The smartphone is an essential tool. And so even in bed, it's there, oftentimes right in bed, not just off to the side. And this graph is from a few years ago, so I'm guessing the percentage has gone up substantially. This one sort of goes over when it's okay to use a cell phone. For millennials, pretty much any time. Although I actually want to point out that Generation X finds it more appropriate to do so in a meeting setting than millennials. But again, the focus is technology and devices are part of our everyday life, always in our hands. And we've known a world with them. Most of us have known a world with those devices or some element of those devices our entire lives. Lastly, and not surprisingly, millennials have more social media friends than other generations. In these graphs, you can see that it's not just about technology use, but it's what the technology is used for: interaction, collaboration, and connection. Technology is really an extension of who they are and how they communicate. Yes, it's always fun to play Angry Birds and trivia cracks, but it's a deeper connection than using technology simply as a distraction. Julia will get into this a little bit more, but think of how this might impact how they expect to engage in the public planning processes and how it might change the built environment. For example, what does the future of office space look like due to this technological interaction? What are the demands in terms of kinds of technology infrastructure needed for new development? Shifting gears again, educational attainment. The millennial generation is the most well-educated generation in American history. The number of people with bachelor's degree is now nearly 35%. And again, that is more than any previous generation. Here's another graph to illustrate this point. This is just sheer college enrollment. And here's some additional facts. High school graduation rates are at the highest level in more than 2 decades. And of course, technology has played a pretty critical role in educational attainment. According to the U.S. Chamber Foundation, 31% of all higher education students take at least one course online, and I expect that that would grow over time. So this is a great story, right? Education is great. So take a deep breath because there are some negative consequences here. A lot of this attainment is purely to adapt to economic conditions. The annual earnings of those with higher degrees are substantially higher than those with just 2-year degrees or high school degrees. The unemployment rate is 12% for those with just a high school degree, and as low as 3.8% for those with a bachelor's degree. And probably the most shocking to me was the bottom graph, what this means as far as living in poverty. So while millennials are the most well-educated generation, a lot of this is because there really isn't a choice. To even make ends meet, a college degree is basically a requirement. And while this difference has always existed, what this graph is showing is disparity between young adults with and without a college degree. That's always existed. That gap between the two has grown significantly and is the widest since before the silent generation was born. And while millennials are the most well-educated generation, that comes at a pretty big and growing cost. In fact, a record share of young households owe student debt, 37%, and that's in 2010. I'm sure I'm not the only one who hears about this in the news constantly about the growing student debt issue. And more troubling is the median annual earnings have remained flat. So to summarize, while millennials are the most well-educated generation, they have roughly the same median wage as early boomers did, but with far more student debt. And for those who don't have the means to seek higher education, the income gap between those with higher degrees and those without is increasing. As I mentioned, unemployment is also very high for millennials, especially younger millennials. While 18 to 24-year-olds have always had higher unemployment rates, that has been even more pronounced for the millennial generation. And while there's been significant improvement in the U.S. economy, the impact of the recession is still being felt for millennials, with many taking jobs just to pay the bills or student loans. And oftentimes, these jobs are in the service and retail sector with few benefits, more difficult hours, and lower wages. So again, think about how this comes back to transportation and housing. I know from a UTA perspective, Utah Transit Authority perspective, making sure that this generation can reach their jobs, which may or may not coincide with our typical service hours. Along the Wasatch front, this trend is pretty clear, with approximately 30% of workers younger than 29 working in the retail or food service industry. So again, what are the impacts of this? Is there enough low and middle income housing stock to house this generation and these people? Are we allowing our zoning codes enough flexibility with accessory dwelling units and those kinds of things? Is car ownership even feasible for many of these populations? So speaking of transportation, in case you couldn't tell from the title of this presentation, the millennial generation is having and will continue to have a big impact on transportation. This graph is from a national survey that included data collection in Salt Lake City and suggests that age actually has a significant effect on the probability of being a transit user. Simply put, millennials use transit more than boomers. Age, in fact, had more to do with feelings on public transportation and urbanism than the region in which the samples were collected. Those under 30 are the most enthusiastic to ride transit, even though in many cases they didn't really grow up using public transportation. A Millennials and Mobility survey conducted by APTA explored attitudes towards mobility factors and factors that play a role in mobility decision-making. These were listed as sort of the top reasons that millennials use transit. Clearly, expenditure, being cheaper than owning a car, is a big component, but convenience, exercise, and just making sense in the community that they live in were also listed as reasons. The study also listed key advantages that transit has according to millennials. It's pay-per-use, unlike a car. You're only paying for what you're using. You're not paying depreciation on that. There's a strong tie to protecting the environment. and the ability to socialize online. Again, going back to that always connected mentality through technology, that driving a car really doesn't provide that option, although there's more and more car companies looking to meet that demand. But there's also a goal of creating a community and engaging the community listed as a top reason. And there's a lot of data out there to support the millennials not only view transit differently, but behaviors are different for this generation in relation to auto use. This data is gathered from the Utah DMV and the DOT highway statistics related to the number of driver's licenses for 16 and 19-year-olds. The national average has steadily declined, and while Utah has a higher percentage of licensed drivers aged 16 to 19 than the national average, the percent is decreasing at a higher rate than the national average. So even in what I describe as a relatively car-oriented setting, you're seeing these trends take place. Local data is showing that other aspects of millennial transportation preferences as well. This is from the 2012 Utah Household Travel Survey, and it suggests that on the Wasatch front, trip distances, how far they're traveling, is lower for millennials. They take more walking trips and have higher trips to work via transit than any other generation that was sampled. UTA's last onboard survey also showed that approximately 34% of our riders were 24 or younger. So they make a big component of our ridership. We did some additional surveying of our millennial riders and found out that at least locally protecting the environment was just as important as saving money. Part of that has to do with some of the air quality issues that our region deals with. But the millennial population is engaged in those discussions and really see transit as a way of addressing protecting the environment. We also found from those who responded, nearly 60% rode the system 3 or more days a week, and nearly 40% rode 5 days or more. In addition, walking was their primary way of both accessing and leaving the transit system. So they really weren't using a car for any leg of their trip. And this really emphasized the importance of addressing the first and last mile solutions for our agency. First and last mile solutions, those that address connections to and from the transit system, are incredibly important for millennials. A survey conducted by Capital Bikeshare in Washington, D.C., the largest bike share in the nation, which also happens to be in the city with the highest millennial population, demonstrated that its members were predominantly young and highly educated, but less affluent. So again, maybe they didn't have as much of a choice. In this region, we're taking more and more steps to address these kinds of transportation investments. The Green Bike program started a little over 2 years ago, and surveys suggest a pretty strong link between green bike use and transit use. So as an agency, UTA is now actively working with other stakeholders to expand that system outside of downtown Salt Lake City and include Bikeshare at other commuter rail and light rail stations. The local car share program, Enterprise Car Share, also has a very sizable millennial membership population of 40%. And then you factor in ride-sharing programs like Uber and Lyft, which are driven almost entirely off of mobile applications to pair riders with cars. And it's clear that millennials are having very different transportation preferences and making very different choices. And it's not just transportation preferences. It's transportation and land use preference together that is really shaking things up. A recent APA report shows that millennials believe that housing and transportation costs and access to transit, as well as other metropolitan features, are very important when they're deciding where to live. In fact, living expenses was the most important for millennials, higher than economic factors. The same report shows that while most millennials live in a suburban location right now where they have to drive most places, probably many still with their parents, very few want to live in that kind of setting in the future. A suburban area with more walkable amenities is clearly the most preferred preference for this generation. And there are dozens of other studies that show the same sentiment, and in fact broaden it to shift beyond just millennials. This graphic is from a 2011 community preference survey commissioned by the National Association of Realtors. Again, there's a strong preference for downtown areas as well as suburban areas with a mix of housing and businesses, and less preference for suburban settings that are housing only. And I don't know of the 250 so people on the line, but I certainly know that in our region, we haven't built most of these places yet. We're not meeting this demand of what this generation is looking for. And so it comes back to a question of economic development, how we remain competitive as a region, and meeting these challenges, or meeting these expectations to deal with other challenges of urban sprawl, the cost of infrastructure, many of the problems that regions deal with. So looking locally again, and I apologize, but again, we're taking this population very seriously in our agency, and so most of the research I've done has been national, but also very locally focused. And so millennials have indeed left the suburbs, even in the Salt Lake region where they grew up. And they're now more concentrated in urban locations, sort of Ogden, Provo, and Salt Lake City. Those are our most urban cities, urban-type development. Now, of course, a lot of this has to do with locations that have opportunities for higher education. That's also where the large universities, the University of Utah, Weber State, and BYU are located. But it's an interesting trend nonetheless, and something that we're going to keep our eye on. This graph is from an RCLCO presentation, and also suggests a clear distinction of preferred housing for Generation Y and Millennials compared to other generations. While there's still a heavy preference for single-family homes, there's a much larger desire for apartments and condos. And much of this demand, especially in the short term, will be for rental households. This is from a Harvard study projecting rental demand through 2020. And you can clearly see the impact of the aging population. But just as noticeable is the demand from the millennial population. Obviously, a lot of this is economic. Think of the wage and debt statistics that I mentioned before. Where does that down payment for a house come from? And as we've already seen, a location near transit with walkable amenities is their preference. And these amenities come with a much higher land cost, typically. Clearly, many are either being forced to rent because of economic conditions or sacrifice home ownership to live in a certain setting that maybe they just can't afford at the moment. Some of this has to do with preference as well. Renting provides a lot of flexibility that home ownership just doesn't. And there's another millennial trend I'd like to highlight along with this, and that's job hopping. Millennials are known for it. A Forbes article recently stated that millennials now expect to stay in their current job for less than 3 years. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, millennial tenure is only about 2.3 years. A lot of this is due to frustration in paying dues in one place or finding fulfillment with their job. But regardless of why they're leaving, it does have an impact on housing preference. Renting provides the freedom to move and take chances and risks that home ownership doesn't. There are two other trends I'd like to highlight before turning the time over to Julia. The first relates back to job hopping to some degree. Millennials, for all the bad rap of being narcissistic and self-absorbed, truly want to make a difference in their lives, and with their careers, which is noted in the graph here. Being successful in a high-paying career is important, but having a career that benefits society is more important. According to a recent Nielsen publication, 75% of millennials made a financial gift to a nonprofit in 2013, and more millennials did volunteer work in 2013 than any other generation. I will mention that I saw an article yesterday, I'm not sure if it was, I think it was Bloomberg, that mentioned that millennials don't volunteer at all. So clearly there's some difference of opinion on how motivated this generation is, but speaking personally, I'm involved in transportation and land use planning because of that desire to do something larger than myself and for my community. Millennials are also more active voters than Generation X. And however, despite this sort of do-gooder attitude, social trust is at an all-time low. And let's be honest, it's low for everyone, but especially for millennials. I think that this brings up an interesting relationship with local planning and politics. This generation wants to be involved, wants to accomplish great things, but they're incredibly untrusting. How do we as practicing planners tap into that do-gooder sentiment and overcome that social trust issue? So I'm going to turn the time now to Julia to further explore what these trends mean for planners and the field of planning. What does it mean for providing transportation, for land use planning, for public engagement? Julia?
Wow. Thank you, Richard. That was extremely informative. Every time I'm fortunate enough to hear this presentation, I learn something new about how this is going to impact and how I can be creative about incorporating some millennial trends into my profession. And so I'm here today to help synthesize all of this incredible information that was just provided to us on millennials. Especially as planners, we don't have a crystal ball. So we rely on trends, demographics, and other successful examples to help support our planning decisions. And here in Utah, while we pride ourselves on being extremely unique, and sometimes that can be difficult as a practitioner, we can't always use national examples because we constantly hear Utah, we are different than anywhere else. There are some really unique things going on here, but who would have ever thought that we would have the highest percentage of millennials than anywhere else in the nation? So these trends cannot be more applicable to us. However, it is important to note that second or third slide that Richard posed of the nation, the low end was in the 20s and the high end was in the 30s. So we're seeing these trends everywhere across the nation. And these cannot be more applicable to all of us in our planning efforts right now. So I want to take a moment to discuss with you, who are these millennials? Are we all skinny jeaned hipsters with beards? And just to give you some personal examples of myself and my friends, a coworker of mine and her boyfriend, they decided to be a no-car household. She bikes 9 miles to work one way, that's 18 miles round trip, as her primary and only source of transportation, and does this even in the winter. Another good friend of mine and his wife, they only have one car. They always carpool or take transit or combinations, and they happen to rent this car. They choose not to own it because it is cheaper from the rental car company, who charges them annually on their per mile, how many miles they've driven, not on the time that they're renting, which is incredible. Another local friend, she recently graduated with a master's degree in a good business program, and her class has over 80% in unemployment. It's incredible. And personally, my husband and I, we make the decision to carpool at a minimum of 3 times a week. And trust me, this is a commitment because he's always a little late and I always like to be on time. Both of our cars were born in the 90s. Mine was born in 1994 and his in 99. But we make the decision to always have new technology with our cell phones and our laptops. Together, we have higher educational degrees. And our monthly student loan combined payment is $720 per month. So many of the choices that he and I make for our family is based on our current financial situation. So the examples I just gave you, we are the real deal. We are real people making these choices. Richard didn't make this stuff up, but I do wear skinny jeans, and my husband has a fantastic full beard. So it is my absolute pleasure today to pose some concepts and ideas in how you, in your community, can look to capture more of the millennial preferences in your planning approaches. The 3 areas I'm going to look at and address how they impact the millennial generation is in transportation, land use, and public involvement. And as a transportation planner, mobility and accessibility are always in the forefront of my mind. And I'm sure you all are aware of how interconnected the relationships between transportation planning and land use are. And so, it is best to not ignore them. I know we're starting to make steps towards supporting them and coordinating them, but we should look to always include them in elements of all of our planning efforts in studies and encouraging everyone else to think about this way instead of a previous model of having them being very separated. Let's coordinate and work together with our transportation departments and our planning departments. So transit millennials are one of the most favorable combinations, as Richard mentioned. We want to ride transit. We want to ride our bikes. So let's make these choices easy for us and support these travel choices now before it becomes such an obstacle that we decide to change our minds. So the opportunity is now to keep this momentum alive. We want to build infrastructure to support this behavior, and we want to reinforce this behavior through supporting and prioritizing in our planning efforts for all modes. So how can we do this? How do we support these choices? Zoning. Let's provide zoning that supports good community design. Think about the human scale in our zoning, the facade, the transparency of a building. Form-based codes are emerging for a reason. Or good design standards that can promote these places that give our communities a fantastic sense of place. Pedestrian-friendly design, consisting of sidewalks, curb cuts, good signage, making sure that we give the pedestrian a priority in our community spaces, and overall giving them the best experience possible. Richard mentioned a focus on the first and last mile trip that connects the user to transit. So let's consider that half mile, 3/4 of a mile radius around your transit stations and place considerable improvements, change your land ordinances, and support these land uses. And also enhance the connectivity for alternative modes of bike and pedestrian to get to those transit stations. So millennials like transit. We've proven that. And while location and accessibility to those transit stations are the biggest driver of transportation choice, the ability to text and connect while on the train is almost as important. So as planners, we need to make sure these services are available on the bus and the train. Provide Wi-Fi, provide real-time schedules, make sure they're easy and accessible for us to find, and giving us data information about the travel choices that we're making to continue to reinforce these behaviors. We also heard there's a housing preference for walkable communities by the baby boomers generation, but also mainly by the millennials. And it's continuing to increase. So now we need to figure out ways to support these housing preferences. All the hot places to live in our nation and along the Wasatch Front region possess these desirable qualities. And you can easily see those reflected in the real estate values to show how desirable they are. Trust me. So there's a big demand for these smaller compact developments. There was a recent study, the Utah Values on Growth, showing that 75% of Utahns want to live in a mixed-use, walkable community. We're also seeing new market realities, which affect how we select our homes. We can only afford smaller homes and smaller lots. You're not seeing the previous loans that once were available. There's also the trend to choose more location-based investments. And housing has a new paradigm, I think, on what constitutes affordable housing. Millennials don't want to shovel snow, they don't want to mow the lawn, they don't want to water the lawn. We are the first generation to not make as much money as our parents. And we don't want to spend all of our income on housing and transportation. And so we're choosing multi-level housing, apartments, condos, because it's easier and it's a better choice for us. So now you're seeing a variety of different demographic and cohorts living in these types of homes. Home ownership is also delayed for us because we don't have any money. Our financial situations force us to rent, and that's becoming much more common. So if we have high student loans, we don't have any money for down payment. And there's a limited supply of these walkable places to live. And what this equates to is a higher portion of us renting for longer or purchasing condos that are quote-unquote affordable. So when you're making your planning documents, and I encourage you and beg you to create places for us. Create places for my friends and us millennials to live. Include us in your vision and your goals. Provide housing choices in your planning documents and zone accordingly. Use some of the data that we've provided to help support those decisions. Provide transportation choices and make alternative modes a priority in your documents. When we say multimodal options, we're fortunate enough that Richard and I, the agencies we work for, we've paired with the Utah Department of Health and come up with a master plan design guidelines for bicycle and pedestrian facilities. And we've included the URL here for you. And so trying to provide resources to communities so they can have these at their fingertips in order to make these choices and enable these choices and include them and have resources. So this is a step-by-step guide for a planner to create the biped master plan. And it uses a fun ski resort theme where you can, if you just want an entry-level design guidelines, you can follow the green. And if you want an advanced expert, you follow the blue, very similar to a ski resort or a ski trail. So you ask, how can I do this when I have NIMBYs all over the place in my community? Ask your community to be thoughtful about the land use decisions they're making and the trade-offs. Saying no to growth means that they're saying yes to something else. Saying no to mixed use means that they're saying yes to something else. So show them what that yes is. Show them the financial implications of these choices: sprawl versus compact development, efficiency in that type of development. Show them pictures. Show them the tax benefits, the sales tax and property tax implications. Nowadays, we're fortunate enough to have the technology for scenario planning tools where we can show the data behind impacts of planning in one path versus planning in another path. And we're able to compare and contrast that. If you don't have these technologies available to you, pictures, visual preferences. We don't want change. Well, this is what you currently have. It's industrial. How do we move to something else? Just really thinking about putting that responsibility of providing choices for your community and what your community can create, and that responsibility on not only your elected officials but also the public. So shifting gears a little bit more, the spending power of this group, because we are the largest cohort, is going to have significant sway. And understanding the preferences in our spending choices. To us, the experience of where we're going to go and where we're going to play is the most important. So the sense of place for the commercial spaces is very important. We want to be with our friends. We want to have social outlets, ice cream parlors, coffee shops, outdoor seating, just ensuring that the public sphere is really has a component to all of your commercial places. We live in smaller places, and so we have less money. I think we're going to see a lot of commercial districts and a lot of commercial malls be moving in a different direction, as much of where we shop is now online. So my sister is 25, and she lives on Amazon Prime. Everything she buys is through the internet. We can price compare. We can take the time out of shopping and do it all through the internet. This also helps us understand more about why we eat, breathe, and live in our devices. And since we only know a world of information at our fingertips, we expect to be connected through our devices. We expect information to always be at our fingertips, especially if you want to include us in planning situations. And so this presents many opportunities for public involvement. We care about our community, we care about the environment, and we want our lives to make a positive change and impact. So this could be a huge driver, if leveraged appropriately, to get us to be involved in your community's planning decisions. And this could pose some obstacles for the traditional open house. You may not capture our generation if this is your only form of public involvement, because we expect to do things on our own terms through technology when we have our own time. So public meetings, 6 to 7 p.m. at night, are very inconvenient to us. So I ask you to take your outreach to our places of interest in order to capture the views and choices of our generation. And Salt Lake City has been on the front lines with this, and I also encourage you to look at some of the best practices that have been coming out of their Department of Institutional Engagement. They and many other communities along the nation are taking their public engagement out. So take it to the farmers markets, take it to the music festivals. I promise you that no planning staff will ever complain about getting out of the office and emerging themselves into your community. Look at social media. Develop a communications plan on how you're going to leverage these kind of tools and how you can engage through social media. QR codes make it easier. Online surveys. For example, Richard and I are heavily involved in a general plan update for a small suburban community. We had 33 folks attend our open house, and 204 respond in favor of this small area plan. We're also participating in another study that has had over 3,000 responses online, and you can block it so you just get one single IP address, and that's incredible to get that kind of involvement. Then you can aggregate and show that maybe different groups that you haven't heard from, you're capturing their voice. As we all know, most of the time we'll hear from angry or upset or opposed residents come to our open houses. How can we make it easier for the unheard groups that aren't represented, that aren't able to make it to those night meetings? And I think going through technology is really the answer. And so this is only the beginning that we'll see the effects of this generation as we age and as we move forward. I think we're going to continue to feel the effects of this culture and this generation. But how exciting in our planning field, where things are ever changing, for us to meet the needs of these future generations. And that's it for me. Richard, do you have any additional thoughts before we conclude?
Sure, yeah, we'll open up to questions in just a second, but just to reiterate, we can't tell what the future is going to bring, but we need to understand the trends and the market preferences to help support our decisions. And it is up to us to support the desires of this generation and give them the choices and opportunities that they're looking for, especially those that lead to a more sustainable future. As Julia alluded to, two things could happen. Either we don't meet these preferences and the millennial generation eventually, even though they want different land uses and transportation choices, they don't get it, and so they revert back to previous desires and what they have to accommodate. Or some areas will become real winners with the millennial population, and it will drive economic development to those areas that get it, and other areas that don't get it as well will struggle. Really, the best thing that you can do as a planner for this generation is to make sure they have a voice and are engaged in your planning processes. When discussing important issues like providing multimodal options, offering different housing choices, or allowing a mix of land uses, make sure this generation's desires and associated trends are not ignored. So even if that generation isn't in your community right now, it's something you should be talking about with the public and with your elected officials. Help the community understand the impacts of these trends. Undoubtedly, the cohort has and will continue to reshape this country and its built environment. So that's it. We are happy to take questions now.
Great, thank you. All right, we have a few questions that we already have in here, and folks, again, feel free to type your questions into that chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and if it's for a particular person, either for Julia or Richard, just please state so. Okay, the first question. I hear a lot about micro-housing units. Is this trend something that appeals to millennials?
Yeah, I think it does. Again, they are getting married later or opting out of marriage. They're job hopping a lot. There's a desire to not spend as much on housing, either for economic condition issues or they'd rather spend their money elsewhere. And so, especially for younger millennials, I mean, they may age out of a 350 square foot apartment, but especially that younger generation, or that younger portion of that generation, I think micro units are definitely something that they're interested in, and even in Salt Lake City is something that some the developers are interested in. And it's not, that's pretty unheard of, those kinds of micro units in somewhere where land is fairly easy to develop on sort of the more suburban and rural areas. Julia, do you want to add anything? No? Okay.
Great, thank you. Next question. I think, Julia, I know you touched on it, talking about your sister and Amazon Prime, and how do you see the future of retail centers changing to accommodate the needs and desires of millennials?
I did touch on it a little bit. I think the commercial strip mall becomes a lot less appealing. To bring it back a little bit bigger picture, we live in smaller places. We don't have the same kind of space that you would see in a really large single-family home. So we're not filling that space with a lot of consumer goods. We're being a little bit more particular about where we're spending our money on those material objects. In addition, you don't get to price compare when you walk into that store when you can on Amazon. I think we're going to see a decline in those commercial strip malls unless we have a brand new beautiful development here in Utah, a little bit north of Salt Lake City, and it's based around a transit center. It has excellent outdoor public spaces where you can bring your kids, a splash pad park, outdoor seating, a nice mix of excellent restaurants combined with commercial, nice retail components and offices. So you have a variety of different uses in that small place, and it's highly accessible. There's a lot of sidewalks and bike paths to get to that development, in addition to being able to access there through transit. So I think having many different types of uses and having that public space is really what we're going to start to see in terms of those commercial spaces that thrive. Not to say that there won't be a market for the strip mall. I just think it's going to move away from that. We've seen that in, personally, my mother worked in a bookstore, and as more and more people would buy their books online or buy used books online, a bookstore would have to find other ways to be more viable, and that was to open up a coffee shop. So there are creative solutions for commercial businesses. I just think that you're going to have a social and a social component to it to attract millennials for your business. You want to add anything else, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, just alongside that, what we've heard constantly in relation to developers around our stations, they're looking to create lifestyle centers rather than commercial developments. Again, all those mix of uses together. But that's not to say that millennials don't want to go to a store and, you can look at something on the internet, but there's still something about having something tangible in your hands and seeing that. And so, not real estate, but the retail industry, they're smart people, and they're starting to understand how they can make brick and mortar work with online. And so offering coupons to go into the store, offering applications so you can do price comparing while you're in the store. So that being said, there's probably going to be less brick and mortar stores, but they're certainly not dead. And as Julia mentioned, it's just how they're built, where they're located, and what other uses are around those.
Thank you. That's excellent.
Great. And I think also maybe if you could touch a little bit about the types of commercial retail. I'm a millennial too, and there are a lot of my friends, we don't really do the big box, the big retail stores anymore. It's more about the small, locally owned niche stores, your natural organic stores, things like that. Do you have any comments on the types of retail that millennials are more interested in?
Yeah, I mean, again, sort of going back to that do-gooder mentality, there's sort of a stigma with big box stores being sort of a nameless corporate giant that millennials have trouble with. And actually, that's not to say that those retail places don't work, but even the shape and form of those, if they have a slightly smaller footprint, are built to look more part of the community instead of surrounded by a sea of asphalt, they'll likely attract more millennials. But you're right, there's definitely a component for shopping local, sort of that social aspect, social good aspect of the millennial population.
Just to add to that, I laugh, the Tom shoes, the buy one, give one, and the shoes themselves have no orthotic support whatsoever, but they are popular everywhere. And so as a business like that, because you can purchase something and feel good about where your money is going, has so much appeal to this generation.
I can't tell you how many times I've picked up a pair of Tom's shoes thinking, oh, I really, really want them, but they're really uncomfortable.
Exactly, exactly.
Okay, next question. This is a good question. How do millennials deal with digital dead zones, such as Western Massachusetts, for example?
I suspect not well. I mean, I don't know how many times I've just checked my phone while we're doing this conference call. I mean,
that's hilarious.
It's difficult. I mean, that is the #1 way we communicate is through digital social media.
I'm going to chime in here because I grew up living in north part of New Hampshire, and when I go back in the summers to see my family, it is tough. It is tough. I will actually drive 15 minutes from where our friends live so I can get cell phone service. I think in the past 24 hours I've probably sent about 50 text messages. My husband and I don't talk on the phone. I'm not sure that if a community wants to be aggressive about pursuing having a diverse, really being aggressive in capturing millennials, that not having cell service or offering really fast internet service, they're going to be that competitive. And so here in Utah, we're doing a couple studies on our increasing some of our web capacity to other areas of the western side that is greatly emerging. And I think you have to be proactive in providing technology, or else you're not going to capture this group.
Okay, next question. This is another good one. These are good. How do you incorporate millennial preferences in a non-millennial community, or do you? Millennials comprise only 20% of our first-rank community, and more than 60% are older than millennials. This older group is a vocal majority, and they don't understand and don't want millennial land use preferences. And I'm sure that there are a lot of folks on this call that can relate to this. Do you have any comments?
Sure, I'll start, and Julie, you can chime in. But one, I would say, we're planning for the future, and you may not have millennial population now, but at some point, it's a huge population. It is a big component, and they're going to be driving economic development. They're going to be driving sales tax, income and land tax. So you have to consider the future of your community. So you may not have them now, but you may want to get them in the future, if not just of being an inclusive community, then to be better off from an economic development perspective. Also, I would say that a lot of the trends that we've talked about, they're very stark and clear for the millennial population, but as the baby boomer generation gets older, they're looking for a lot of the same things. Downsizing their home, walkable communities where they don't have to drive because maybe they won't be able to in a short number of years. So you're talking about the two biggest populations in the U.S., and you're not going to accommodate either of those populations. It just doesn't seem like a good way to plan. And that's how I'd frame it, I guess. I mean, I'd put it probably nicer than that in a public meeting, but that's essentially what it boils down to.
And you could maybe try and use some data to back up those decisions and the cause and what it's going to have in your community with some scenario planning or just some statistics on what's going to happen as your community moves into the workforce, moves into not having to import a bunch of service workers. I'm not sure what the composition of the employment is in the area, but I would really try to show how having a more diverse community can really enhance and support if those are the overall sense of the community, if those are the goals that you guys have.
And that's not to say that it'll work every time. We've been in meetings where they basically say, we don't want to have millennials. Just make sure that it's not a vocal minority that's the only voice you're hearing. Is that really the sentiment of the entire community?
Okay, thank you. Next question. I'm hearing more about pink zones to allow millennials more opportunities to cut through the City Hall red tape such that it will be easier to build affordable housing and developments. Can either of you comment on this?
I haven't heard that term before, so I can't speak directly to that term, but I do know that specifically in our region, one of the reasons that a lot of communities are looking at more form-based codes or just design criteria within their codes, especially in their mixed-use, transit-oriented areas, is to eliminate some of the review process. So not everything is going to the Planning Commission or the City Council to get approval. It's something that developers can do right at the counter and shave off 3 months. And that's important, especially with higher density mixed-use developments, because they're challenging to do, they're expensive to do. Shaving that off makes it much more likely that development will occur.
Okay, another question. How do communities without universities or high-tech jobs compete to retain millennials?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, not everywhere is going to have a university, and not everywhere is going to be Silicon Valley or even some of the tech centers that we're seeing occur along the Wasatch Front. But looking regionally, does the region compete in some of those areas? We have people going to the University of Utah from, roughly 4 or 5 counties along the Wasatch Front. And so that population doesn't necessarily have to be right at the university to want that. And again, as the millennial generation ages, the importance of being right next to a university may not be as important. The tech center issue is a little bit more important. I think regionally we have a strategy to connect communities that don't have those centers through transportation and transit specifically, so that it's easy to get to those places. So you're still meeting the housing demand and the demands in those communities that don't have it, but they're able to get to their job without having to use a car, those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. I think overall, creating those types of communities that they want to live in. I mean, look again, back to that graphic that Richard showed, where the majority of states across the nation are 20% millennial-based states. And so finding what you can do within your community to attract them with other services and other jobs, it's just really hard to pinpoint it only on education and technology. I think you could look at transportation and creating more of those, like an urban environment, because you're going to have millennials in your community. They just may not be the dominant population.
Right. And also, some of the other things that millennials are interested in. So, for example, looking at your zoning code, looking at vacant properties and having urban farms, all those kinds of things that might entice or reach a millennial, audience of. It may not have a tech center, it may not be near a university, but it has some really cool, urban, open-minded kind of aspects to it.
Thank you. The next couple questions are specifically for Utah, out west. The Utah millennial population, how much is homegrown as opposed to in-migration?
I don't have a specific statistic, but I mean, I don't think it's a shock to anybody on the phone that, Utah County specifically has the birth rate of like a third world country. I mean, a lot of it is homegrown. Then there's a cultural component. That being said, there's also a lot of immigration, especially on the west side of Salt Lake City, on the west side of Salt Lake County. There's a lot of immigration, Hispanic immigration. So I'm not sure on the percentages, but it's a combination of the two. I couldn't say which one is more.
We do have the fastest growing population growth rate in the nation right now. So due to the birth rate, the reproductive rate, how quickly we have kids, and the immigration, I think this area has done an incredible job with attracting tech companies and also companies that are based in like an outdoor recreation style as well. We have Adobe's relocated here. We have eBay. We have Overstock. And just our close proximity to the mountains and the outdoors has also attracted a lot of younger millennials to this area as well that are looking and active in those jobs. So it's probably a combination, but of both that attributes to being the winner for the millennial group.
Okay, and what is the age trend for ownership of farm and ranch enterprises in the West? Any idea?
I can't speak to that. I mean, just farm ownership, the number of farms has decreased substantially over the last, few decades. As far as the age of the people running those farms or working on those farms in Utah, I don't know. I mean, again, I'm primarily focused on the urban transportation, the most urbanized area in terms of transportation along the Wasatch Front. So don't really have any statistics on agriculture.
Okay. Next question. Policymakers, home builders, realtors, banks, and most property owners continue to resist change in my community. How have you worked on changing attitudes of these groups?
Want to give this one
example? Yeah, Julia, do you want to take that? I can add in.
Yeah.
I mean, really, it's education, as much education, and going out and speaking to the city councils, to the community, as frequently as possible to talk about these issues. And one of the things that's unique about the Wasatch Front is the amount of collaboration between different agencies. So, there's a whole effort called the Wasatch Choice for 2040 in our region that is really focused on sort of centered, higher density development to accommodate the explosive growth that we're seeing. And so communities are hearing it from not just UTA, not just WFRC, but even the Utah Department of Transportation, other MPOs, the counties. They're all involved in sort of a larger message of how important this is. And of course, Envision Utah continues to play a major role in framing that discussion statewide and especially along the Wasatch Front.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to add a little bit in on kind of a small area plan that Richard and I have both been leading in a suburban part of Utah, and that we encountered a lot of the NIMBYism for don't bring that type of development to my area, but we approached our planning process with how can we educate, how can we inform, how can we represent the other voices that aren't being heard to adequately get more than just a small sample size from those that are opposed to this. So in our public process, we really reached out through technology and developed online surveys, developed websites, had a comment and a forum for them to come in and through electronic means provide their comment to the plan. And then we also use scenario planning to provide the decision makers with data. So scenario planning where we said, here's our, let's do our growth as usual, business as usual. Let's have our next scenario be a very heavy transit-oriented development, mixed use, and then have our third scenario be a little bit of a hybrid of a little bit mixed use light. And then we're able to show the different implications of those three scenarios in terms of the outputs being sales tax, property tax, population growth, jobs, housing balance, transportation choices, impact on service demand, the type of housing that you would see in all these developments, how much it would cost to afford all of these different types of developments. And so by providing that, I think we were able to effectively show both the public and the decision makers that growing in a mixed-use way is much more efficient and has many advantages. And choosing to grow as currently planned also has many implications on traffic and air quality. And we use that data, but we also brought in the police department, fire department, and school district to talk about what to address some of the NIMBY concerns about what they would see in that area as well. And it really wasn't as bad as everyone thought when they heard it from the police chief. And so to really tactfully address a lot of these concerns using data to support your decision. Sorry, that was a really long example, but I think as we move forward with planning, there's just so many tools at our fingertips and so many resources at our fingertips that we need to utilize them to provide that education to our public.
And I'll just add one more thing. I mean, definitely in Utah, and I suspect everywhere else, if you can equate it to dollars, if you can equate it to economic development on how this makes the community prosperous in terms of money, or how it saves the community money by not sprawling and having to take on additional infrastructure that they can't afford, that really has lended a lot of credence to the work that we've done. If we can make that argument that, look, this is not just sort of a planner kumbaya kind of thing. This is about how we're competitive, how your area is competitive economically.
Mm-hmm. And showing that there can be positive impacts on, say, your home value if it's in a more walkable neighborhood, using that data. And lastly, just to add, in that whole process, we continue to reinforce that by having those voices through the internet, by having that online survey, by taking in the comments through the internet, we were able to show the majority were in favor for a mixed-use center, and showing that throughout the entire process it was shaped from that voice. It wasn't just, it was all supported by what the public wanted. So continue to reinforce that as you move forward, because as we all know, the folks that come to the meetings are not always the best sampling of what our community makes, the composition of our community.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Was there a specific tool or program used in the scenario planning that you've spoken about?
Our region has chosen to use Envision Tomorrow, Envision Tomorrow Plus, a scenario planning software. It is a free.
Yeah, it's a GIS Excel-based scenario planning tool that is, again, it's free to use, but you have to have ArcMap and obviously Microsoft Office to use it. You can download it from the Wasatch Choice for 2040 website. If you just Google that, you can get there. It's called Envision Tomorrow Plus. It is, it requires parcel level information to look at sort of baseline, and it lets you paint in different scenarios, and then has all sorts of very complex equations to basically tell you what your output is based on those things that you painted in.
Community Viz is another one.
Community Viz is another. There's a couple different applications out there that I'm aware of, but that's the one that we use.
Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap up. So Julia Collins and Richard Brockmeyer, thank you for joining us today, and for the Utah chapter for hosting. Again, CM credits are still pending, but you can go and view the video after today at our YouTube site. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. Or you can go to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast to get a PDF version of this as well. So again, Julia and Richard, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Utah chapter. And everyone, have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.